Welcome, my friends. Tonight, you and I will travel through a story that is more than just words. It's an experience that will transport you back to a time when survival wasn't guaranteed, when warmth was precious, and when the simple act of waking up each morning was a victory worth celebrating. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? I love seeing our community spread across the globe. Someone might be watching this during their lunch break in Tokyo, while another person is settling in for the night in London. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this journey we're about to take together is going to be unforgettable. Tonight, we're going to step into the worn, frozen boots of medieval peasants, the unsung heroes who faced winters so brutal they would make our modern complaints about a broken heater seem laughably trivial. These weren't people living in heated castles or feasting in grand halls. These were ordinary men, women, and children who, despite having almost nothing, managed to survive some of the coldest, most merciless nights in human history. Picture this with me for a moment. It's the year 1340, somewhere in rural England. The sun has set, taking with it any hope of warmth. Outside, the wind doesn't just blow, it screams, rattling the thin walls of a peasant's hut like an angry beast trying to break in. There's no electricity, no gas heating, no thick winter coats from modern stores. There's just a family huddled together, using nothing but their wits, their determination, and whatever scraps they could gather to make it through another night without freezing to death. What fascinates me about these people isn't just that they survived. It's how they turned survival into an art form. They developed ingenious strategies that would make modern survival experts nod in respect. From banking fires to sleeping with livestock, from layering dirt and grime as insulation, to sharing body heat in ways that redefined the meaning of family closeness. These peasants were masters of adaptation. But here's what strikes me most deeply about their story. They didn't just endure. They found ways to maintain their humanity, their community bonds, their faith, and even moments of joy in the midst of circumstances that would break most of us today. They told stories by flickering firelight, shared their last bits of food with neighbors, and held on to hope when everything around them seemed hopeless. Tonight, we're going to explore their world in intimate detail. We'll discover the makeshift insulation tricks that kept them alive, the communal sleeping strategies that became a matter of life and death, and the simple but brilliant innovations that separated the living from the dead when winter showed no mercy. We'll learn about their homes, if you can call them that, structures so drafty that the cold seemed to have a permanent invitation inside. We'll understand their clothing, their food, their daily battles against hypothermia, and the quiet heroism that defined their existence. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a story of human resilience that will make you look at your own life differently. Every time you adjust your thermostat, every time you pull a warm blanket over yourself, every time you wake up comfortable in your heated home, you'll remember the medieval peasants who fought for every degree of warmth, who celebrated every morning they woke up with all their fingers and toes intact. Their story is one of grit, ingenuity, and an unbreakable determination to see another dawn. They faced odds that seem impossible by today's standards. Yet, they didn't just survive. They built communities, raised families, maintained traditions, and passed down wisdom that echoes through the centuries. So, settle in. Dim the lights if you'd like. Maybe grab a warm drink, something these medieval heroes would have considered an impossible luxury. Let the soft hum of your heating system or the gentle whir of a fan remind you of how different our world is from theirs. And let's travel together back to a time when every breath in the cold air was a small victory. Every ember that stayed lit through the night was a miracle, and every family that woke up together in the morning had won another battle in humanity's endless war against the elements.
When you and I think of medieval life, our minds probably drift to images we've seen in movies. Grand castle feasts, knights in shining armor, perhaps a jolly tavern scene with people laughing around roaring fires. But let me paint you a very different picture, one that's far more accurate and infinitely more humbling. For the average medieval peasant, winter wasn't a season to be enjoyed or even tolerated. It was an annual appointment with death that arrived with terrifying regularity. Imagine if, every single year, you knew that for several months, your very survival would depend entirely on your ability to outsmart cold so severe it could kill you in your sleep. That was the reality for millions of ordinary people throughout medieval Europe. The numbers alone should give us pause. Historical records suggest that in particularly harsh winters, entire villages could lose 20 to 30% of their population. Children, the elderly, the sick, they were the first to go, but even healthy adults in their prime could be found frozen in their beds come spring. Winter wasn't just cold, it was a predator that stalked every household, waiting for the moment when the fire died down too low, when the food ran out, or when exhaustion finally overcame the endless vigilance required to stay alive. But here's what I find remarkable about these people. They didn't accept defeat. Generation after generation, they developed, refined, and passed down survival strategies that would make modern wilderness experts genuinely impressed. They turned the art of staying alive into a complex science, even though they had no formal education, no books to reference, and certainly no internet to consult for tips. Their homes, as we'll explore in detail, were barely more than organized piles of sticks, mud, and hope. Picture living in what's essentially a very large basket, smeared with a mixture that included animal dung. Yes, actual dung, because it was cheap, available, and surprisingly effective at filling gaps. The walls were so thin, you could probably have conversations with your neighbors 3 houses away, assuming the howling wind didn't drown out your voice entirely. These weren't the cozy cottages we see in fairy tale illustrations. These were structures where the indoor temperature was maybe a few degrees warmer than whatever nature was throwing at the outside walls. If it was 10 degrees below freezing outside, you might be lucky enough to have it be only 5 degrees below freezing inside your own home. Congratulations, you're technically warmer. You're also still in immediate danger of dying from the cold. The medieval peasant's wardrobe would make modern minimalists weep. You owned perhaps 2 or 3 rough garments, and when winter came, you wore them all at the same time. Layering wasn't a fashion choice, it was a survival strategy. You put on everything you owned and hoped it would be enough. If you were fortunate enough to have a cloak, it probably smelled like the goat it came from and had more holes than a piece of Swiss cheese, but it might mean the difference between life and death on a particularly brutal night. Food became scarce, and what little remained had to serve double duty: nutrition and internal heating. The peasants discovered that a belly full of heavy, hot food could provide hours of internal warmth. But this created a cruel equation. You needed more food in winter to generate body heat precisely when food was scarcest. It was like being told you need to drive further just when your gas tank is running on empty. Sleep, something we take completely for granted, became a strategic operation requiring military-level planning. Who would tend the fire? How would the family arrange themselves for maximum heat retention? Which children were small enough to tuck between the adults? Where would the livestock sleep? Yes, livestock, because in medieval winter survival, your cow wasn't just your livelihood. She was your heating system, your companion, and possibly your lifeline. But perhaps most remarkably, these people didn't just endure this hardship in isolation. They created support systems, community networks, and mutual aid societies that put many modern communities to shame. They understood with crystal clarity that winter survival was a team sport. Your neighbor's fire going out wasn't just their problem, it was everyone's problem. Because today it's their house, tomorrow it might be yours. They developed early warning systems, shared resources, took in families whose homes had become inhabitable, and created informal but highly effective networks that could mean the difference between a village surviving winter intact or becoming a ghost town by spring. In a time before government aid, before insurance, before any safety net except the one you wove yourself with your neighbors, community solidarity wasn't just nice, it was literally life-saving. As we journey deeper into their world, we'll discover just how ingenious these solutions were and how much we modern humans could learn from people who faced impossible odds with nothing but determination and each other.
Let me take you inside a medieval peasant's home, though calling it a home might be generous. Imagine the draftiest place you've ever been. Maybe an old cabin with gaps in the walls, or a garage with a broken door. Now imagine that place is your castle, your fortress against winter's assault, and your survival depends entirely on its ability to keep you alive through months of sub-freezing temperatures. The construction method that historians politely call wattle and daub sounds almost quaint when you read about it in textbooks. The reality was far less charming. Imagine a giant basket, woven from whatever sticks and branches you could gather, then smeared, and I mean thoroughly smeared, with a mixture that would make you wrinkle your nose in disgust. Mud, straw, animal hair, and yes, fresh animal dung, all mixed together into a paste that builders hoped would harden into something resembling insulation. Now, before you recoil in horror at the thought of living in a house partially made of manure, consider the logic. Dung was free, abundant, and surprisingly effective at plugging gaps. It was sticky when wet, hardened when dry, and provided a barrier against wind that could mean the difference between waking up alive or not waking up at all. These peasants weren't being gross for the sake of it. They were being practical with materials that could literally save their lives. But even with this creative construction, the walls stood almost no chance against a determined winter storm. Cold found every weakness, every tiny gap, every place where the mud had cracked or the sticks had shifted. The medieval peasant's home wasn't so much a shelter as it was a slightly more organized way to experience the outdoors. Wind didn't just seep in, it danced through these structures, swirling around the single room, ensuring that warmth never got too comfortable or stayed in one place too long. The roof situation was equally precarious. Thatch looked picturesque in paintings, but living under it was another matter entirely. Made from straw, reeds, or whatever plant material was available, these roofs sagged under the weight of snow, leaked when it rained, and occasionally granted unexpected visitors access to your dinner table. Nothing quite like having a squirrel drop from the ceiling onto your evening meal to remind you that your home wasn't exactly fortress-like in its security. Windows, if they existed at all, weren't the clear glass portals we know today. Glass was so expensive that even wealthy merchants could barely afford it, and peasants? They made do with animal hides, pieces of cloth, or wooden shutters that could be closed against the worst weather. The choice was simple: let in light and freeze, or stay warm and live in darkness. Most chose darkness and survival.
The floor, calling it a floor, was often nothing more than packed earth. Sometimes, if the family was particularly prosperous or industrious, they might spread straw or dried rushes across the dirt. But this created its own problems. The organic material decomposed, attracted pests, and created a kind of living carpet that developed its own ecosystem. Medieval housekeeping meant occasionally throwing fresh rushes on top of the old ones, creating layers of history beneath your feet, and not necessarily pleasant history. When heavy rains came, the dirt floors turned into mud. When snow melted, water seeped up from the ground, creating indoor marshlands that made every step an adventure in balance and endurance. You weren't just dealing with cold air. You were dealing with cold, wet conditions that sapped body heat even more efficiently than dry cold. Privacy, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. In a single-room home shared by an entire family, plus any extended relatives who might have joined for warmth, plus the livestock that absolutely had to come inside during the worst weather, personal space was a luxury no one could afford. Children slept curled up with parents, grandparents shared bedding with grandchildren, and everyone learned to respect the delicate art of pretending not to notice when someone else was having a private moment. The ingenuity came in the details. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, clay, rags, anything that might slow down the wind's assault. They arranged their few possessions to create windbreaks within their own homes. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether their shelter would hold through another night or whether emergency repairs were needed immediately. Living in these conditions required a mental toughness that's hard for us to comprehend. Every morning that the walls were still standing, that the roof hadn't collapsed under snow, that the floor wasn't completely flooded, was a small victory. These weren't homes in the sense we understand them. They were survival shelters that families hoped would be good enough to see them through until spring returned and the earth warmed up enough to make life possible again.
While medieval peasants fought the obvious enemy of freezing air swirling through their homes, they faced an equally dangerous and far more insidious foe, the frozen ground beneath their feet. This was warfare on two fronts, and the enemy below was often the more merciless of the two. Picture this. You're lying down to sleep, exhausted from a day of trying to stay warm and find enough food to keep going. You've wrapped yourself in every piece of cloth you own, huddled close to your family, positioned yourself as near to the dying fire as you dare without risking your hair or clothing. But there's one thing you can't escape. The earth itself has become your enemy. Medieval floors, as I mentioned, weren't really floors in any sense we'd recognize. They were just slightly flatter areas of dirt inside the walls. Sometimes, if fortune smiled on a family, they might have scattered straw or old rushes across this packed earth, creating the illusion of comfort. But make no mistake, you were sleeping with only the thinnest barrier between your body and ground that could be frozen solid for months at a time. The cold from below was relentless and patient. It seeped upward like a living thing, working its way through whatever thin material separated it from your body, creeping into your bones with the persistence of water finding cracks in stone. Modern sleep experts tell us that we lose most of our body heat through contact with cold surfaces, and medieval peasants learned this lesson the hard way, night after night, winter after winter. They tried everything they could think of to combat this underground assault. Straw was piled thick when they could get it, but straw has its own problems. It compressed under weight, becoming less effective as insulation with each passing night. It attracted moisture, which made it even colder. It provided homes for fleas, lice, and other creatures that made sleep even more miserable. And worst of all, it was expensive. Straw was valuable animal feed, and using it for human comfort meant potentially hungry livestock come spring. Some families tried layering dried rushes instead of straw. These tall grasses could create decent insulation when fresh, but they had their own drawbacks. Over time, families would add new rushes on top of old ones without removing the bottom layers, creating what amounted to a slowly decomposing mattress. The older rushes would rot, creating moisture and odor, while hosting an entire ecosystem of insects and small creatures. It was like sleeping on a living compost pile that occasionally rustled with unexpected movement. For those who could manage it,
Hides provided better protection against ground cold, but hides were precious commodities. They were needed for clothing, for water containers, for repairing tools and equipment. Using a hide as a ground cover meant sacrificing it for other essential purposes. It was always a trade-off between immediate comfort and long-term survival. The cruel mathematics of medieval winter survival meant that beds, when they existed at all, weren't much better than sleeping directly on the ground. These were wooden frames, if you were lucky enough to have wood to spare for such luxury, stuffed with more straw, more hay, more of the same materials that compressed, attracted pests, and provided minimal insulation against the cold radiating from below. What struck me most when researching this topic was how medieval peasants learned to sleep differently than we do. They didn't toss and turn seeking comfort. They moved strategically, shifting position to keep blood flowing, to prevent any part of their body from staying in contact with cold surfaces too long. Sleep became an active survival skill rather than passive rest. Some ingenious families developed primitive heated bed systems. They would take stones from around the fire, wrap them in rags or old cloth, and place them in their sleeping areas before lying down. The stones retained heat for hours, providing localized heat that could make the difference between sleeping and simply enduring the night in frozen misery. But this required careful planning. Heat the stones too much, and you risk burns or fires. Too little, and they provided no benefit. The psychological impact of this constant cold assault from below cannot be overstated. Imagine never, ever being able to simply lie down and feel secure in your warmth. Every night was a calculated risk. Every morning was a small miracle. These people developed a kind of sleep discipline that would astound us today. They could rest while remaining alert to the danger that their own beds posed to their survival. The cold earth didn't just threaten their comfort or their sleep. It was an active threat to their lives, working patiently through every night of every winter to steal their body heat and their breath. And yet, they found ways to outwit it, to bargain with it, to survive its assault long enough to see another spring.
If the medieval peasant's home had a heart, it was the fire. Not a cozy fireplace with a decorated mantle like we might imagine, but a simple, crucial, absolutely essential pile of burning wood that stood between every member of the household and certain death. This wasn't about comfort. This was about survival in its most basic form. Let me paint the picture for you. In the center of that single-room dwelling, there would be a fire pit. Sometimes just rocks arranged in a circle, sometimes a slightly more elaborate construction of stones, but always simple, always functional. There was no chimney in most homes, no neat brick fireplace to contain the flames and direct the smoke. The smoke simply did its best to find its way out through holes in the roof, gaps in the walls, or wherever else it could escape. Much of it, however, decided to stay inside with the family. Living in these homes meant living in a constant haze of wood smoke. Your eyes watered constantly, your lungs worked overtime, filtering the air you breathed. Everything you owned, your clothes, your hair, your skin, carried the permanent scent of smoke. But here's the thing, nobody complained. That smoke meant life. When the smoke stopped, when the air cleared, it usually meant the fire had died, and that was potentially a death sentence. The fire served multiple crucial functions that we, with our modern conveniences, can barely comprehend. It was the only source of heat in the entire home. It was the only source of light after sunset. It was where all food was prepared. There was no kitchen, no stove, no oven, just this one fire that had to handle every cooking need. It was the center of social life, the place where families gathered to talk, to share stories, to maintain the human connections that made survival worthwhile. But perhaps most importantly, it was the guardian that watched over the family through the long, dangerous night. A fire that burned strong and steady was like having a warm, protective parent keeping vigil while children slept. The glow provided psychological comfort as well as physical warmth. In a world where darkness brought very real dangers, both from the cold and from other threats, fire was safety, security, and hope all rolled into a dancing, flickering beacon. The responsibility of maintaining this fire was shared among everyone old enough to understand its importance. Children learned early that this was not a toy, not a convenience, but the difference between their family living or dying. Teenagers took turns staying awake through the night, feeding small pieces of wood to the flames, watching for signs that the fire was failing. Adults planned their entire days around ensuring there would be enough fuel to keep the fire burning through another night. Finding fuel was a constant challenge. Dead wood was gathered obsessively. Every fallen branch, every piece of dried timber was precious. Families would venture out in terrible weather just to collect burnable material because the alternative was unthinkable. They learned to burn almost anything that would produce heat. Dead animal dung, another practical use for what we might consider waste, scraps of wood from broken tools or damaged parts of their homes, even bones when nothing else was available. The fire had to be managed with incredible skill. Too small, and it wouldn't provide enough warmth to keep the family alive. Too large, and it would consume precious fuel too quickly, leaving nothing for later in the night. The perfect medieval fire was one that burned steadily but efficiently, providing maximum warmth while consuming minimum fuel. This required constant attention, constant adjustment, constant vigilance. Different types of fuel required different techniques. Green wood provided longer-lasting coals but was harder to ignite and produced more smoke. Dry wood caught quickly but burned fast. Animal dung burned with a steady, though not very hot flame. Experienced fire tenders developed an almost mystical understanding of how different materials behaved, how to combine them for optimal results, how to coax the maximum heat from whatever meager resources they had available. The social dynamics around the fire were fascinating. Seating wasn't random. It was determined by survival needs. The youngest children and the oldest adults got the spots closest to the flames. Pregnant women, the sick, and the frail were given priority for the warmest positions. Healthy adults took the outer spots, serving as human shields against the cold drafts that constantly tried to invade their space. But the fire was also moody and unpredictable. A sudden gust of wind down through the roof opening could scatter sparks or blow smoke in all directions. A piece of green wood could sputter and hiss, filling the room with acrid smoke that made breathing difficult. An improperly built fire could collapse, sending burning embers across the floor and creating a real risk of the entire home catching fire. Despite all these challenges, the fire was beloved. It was the beating heart of medieval domestic life, the warm center around which everything else revolved. When peasants told stories, shared meals, made plans, or simply sat in grateful silence after surviving another day, they did it in the circle of light and warmth that this simple, essential fire provided.
Of all the skills a medieval peasant had to master, few were as crucial or as nerve-wracking as the art of banking the fire for the night. This wasn't simply a matter of convenience, it was quite literally a life or death technique that determined whether a family would wake up alive the next morning. Imagine the psychological pressure. Every single night, as darkness fell and the cold began its assault in earnest, someone in the family had to make critical decisions about the fire that would determine everyone's fate. Let it burn too freely through the night, and you'd wake up to cold ashes and no fuel left to restart it. Let it die completely, and you might not wake up at all. The balance required was so delicate, so precise, that it took years to master and a lifetime of anxiety to maintain. The banking process itself was an intricate ritual passed down from parent to child, like precious family knowledge. First, you had to read the fire, understanding exactly how much heat it was producing, how the wood was burning, what kind of coals it would leave behind. Different types of wood produced different kinds of coals, and successful banking depended on having the right kind of glowing embers to work with. The actual technique involved carefully burying the hottest coals under a precise layer of ash. Too little ash, and the coals would burn away too quickly, consuming themselves before morning. Too much ash, and you'd smother the coals entirely, killing the fire as effectively as dousing it with water.
The ash had to be just the right consistency, not too fine, or it would block all airflow, not too coarse, or it wouldn't provide proper insulation. Experienced firebankers developed almost supernatural senses about this process. They could tell by the color of the coals, by the way the ash settled, by subtle sounds and smells, whether their banking would hold through the night. They learned to listen to the fire as it settled into its banked state, interpreting the small pops and hisses that indicated whether the process was working correctly. But banking wasn't foolproof. An unexpected wind could disturb the ash covering, exposing the coals to air and causing them to burn too quickly. A draft could carry away the heat. Sometimes, the coals were simply not strong enough to survive until morning, no matter how carefully they were tended. Families went to sleep never knowing with complete certainty that they would wake up to the blessing of surviving embers. The morning ritual of revival was equally critical. Someone, usually whoever had the steadiest hands and the best understanding of fire, would carefully approach the banked coals and begin the delicate process of coaxing them back to life. This involved gently disturbing the ash covering, blowing softly on any embers that still glowed, adding the finest kindling available, and praying to whatever gods might be listening that the fire would catch and grow. When banking failed, the alternative was terrifying. Restarting a fire from nothing in medieval times meant striking flint and steel together, trying to create a spark that could catch in a tiny piece of tinder, then nurturing that spark into a flame capable of igniting kindling. This process could take hours, assuming it worked at all. Meanwhile, the cold was actively working to kill everyone in the home. Some families developed backup strategies. They might bank multiple small fires in different locations, reasoning that if one failed, another might survive. Others kept small amounts of specially prepared tinder in warm, dry places, hoping it would be easier to ignite if the main fire died. A few fortunate families might have neighbors close enough to borrow coals from, but this required someone to brave the freezing night and hope their neighbors had been more successful with their own fire banking. The psychological stress of fire banking cannot be overstated. Parents lay awake listening for the sounds that indicated their fire was still alive. Children learned to sleep lightly, unconsciously monitoring the level of warmth in their home throughout the night. Everyone understood that the person responsible for banking the fire carried the lives of the entire family in their hands. Yet, despite the pressure, despite the constant possibility of failure, medieval families maintained their fires through countless winters. They developed intuitive understanding of fire behavior that put modern camping enthusiasts to shame. They learned to work with unpredictable materials, changeable weather, and imperfect conditions to preserve the spark of life that kept their families breathing until spring returned. The banked fire was more than a heating system. It was hope made manifest, a small act of defiance against the crushing certainty that winter wanted them dead.
When all else failed, when the fire was banked and the walls did little to keep out the killing cold, medieval peasants turned to their most reliable source of warmth, each other. What developed was a system of human heat sharing that would make modern people extremely uncomfortable, but which meant the difference between life and death for countless families through countless winters. Privacy, as we understand it today, was not just a luxury these people couldn't afford. It was a concept that could literally kill them. On the coldest nights, survival meant abandoning any notion of personal space and creating what can only be described as human heating systems. Entire families would arrange themselves in carefully planned configurations designed to maximize heat retention and minimize heat loss. The arrangement wasn't random or chaotic. Medieval peasants developed sophisticated understanding of body heat dynamics that would impress modern thermodynamics experts. The warmest, strongest family members positioned themselves on the outside of the group, serving as human insulation for the more vulnerable people in the center. Children, elderly relatives, pregnant women, and anyone who was sick got the premium spots, tucked into the middle of the human pile where they could benefit from heat radiating from all directions. Picture this:
A single room containing perhaps 8 to 12 people of various ages, all wrapped together under whatever blankets, cloaks, or fabric scraps the family possessed. Bodies pressed against bodies, sharing breath, sharing warmth, sharing the basic heat of life itself. It was intimate in a way that modern families can barely imagine, but it was intimacy born of absolute necessity rather than affection. The logistics were complex. Who slept where wasn't determined by preference or comfort, but by strategic heat management. The person who generated the most body heat might be positioned to warm the feet of several others. Small children might be sandwiched between adults, creating pockets of concentrated warmth. Pregnant women, who needed extra heat for both themselves and their unborn children, received special consideration in the sleeping arrangements. But human heat sharing extended beyond just the immediate family. When a neighbor's fire failed, when someone's home became uninhabitable, when disaster struck and left a family without adequate shelter, the response was immediate and unquestioning. There was always room for one more body in the communal warmth. Not because people were naturally more generous then, but because everyone understood that today it might be the neighbor who needed help, but tomorrow it could be you. This created a kind of thermal socialism. The warmth was shared according to need rather than individual ownership. A family with a slightly better shelter, a fire that burned more reliably, or simply more bodies to generate heat, would take in others without expectation of immediate payment. They knew that survival debts would be repaid in kind when circumstances changed, as they inevitably would. The social dynamics of communal sleeping were fascinating and complex. Families developed unspoken rules about movement during the night. If you needed to shift position, you did it slowly and carefully to avoid disrupting the heat balance for everyone else. Coughing or snoring or other nighttime disturbances were tolerated because the alternative, sleeping alone, was potentially fatal. Children grew up understanding that winter sleep was a group activity. They learned to curl their small bodies into whatever warm spaces were available, to share their own heat with siblings and elders, to sleep deeply despite the press of other bodies around them. For them, the modern concept of having their own bed, their own room, their own space would have seemed impossibly luxurious and somewhat strange. Even more remarkable was how these families managed to maintain dignity and privacy within such intimate arrangements. They developed subtle systems of communication, ways of indicating when someone needed a private moment or when adjustments to the sleeping arrangement were necessary. They learned to respect each other's humanity even while pressed together for survival. The elderly played special roles in these human heating systems. While they might not generate as much body heat as younger family members, they often served as the central planning committee for sleeping arrangements. Grandmothers and grandfathers who had survived dozens of winters became the strategic commanders of nighttime heat distribution, making decisions about who slept where based on decades of experience with what worked and what didn't. Disease was always a concern when people lived in such close quarters, but the alternative was freezing to death, which was a more immediate threat than illness. Families accepted the risk of spreading colds or other minor ailments because the certainty of death from cold outweighed the possibility of death from disease. What strikes me most about this system is how it required absolute trust and cooperation. There was no room for selfishness, no possibility of hoarding warmth for yourself. Everyone's survival depended on everyone else's willingness to share the most basic resource, the heat of their own body. It was intimate in a way that modern families can barely imagine, but it was intimacy born of absolute necessity rather than affection.
Now, if you think sharing your sleeping space with your entire extended family was uncomfortable, medieval peasants had another survival strategy that would make modern people absolutely recoil in horror. They shared their homes with their livestock. Not occasionally, not as an emergency measure, but routinely, throughout the winter as a standard part of staying alive.
This wasn't about being fond of animals or having a special connection with nature. This was pure practical mathematics. A cow generates significant body heat. A goat produces warmth. A pig is essentially a living furnace. Chickens, while smaller, are surprisingly warm-blooded creatures. When you're living in a structure that provides minimal protection against sub-freezing temperatures, every source of heat becomes precious, regardless of how that heat is generated or what it smells like. The integration of livestock into the family living space was carefully planned and systematically organized. Cows, being the largest and warmest animals most families owned, received prime real estate, usually positioned against the walls where their substantial body mass could provide heat for the humans sleeping nearby. These weren't pets, they were four-legged heating systems that also happened to provide milk, eventually meat, and valuable labor during warmer months. Goats were particularly prized for winter warmth because they were smaller than cows, making them easier to manage indoors, but they still generated significant heat. Plus, goats are naturally inclined to seek shelter and warmth, so they were often eager participants in the arrangement. They would settle in close to the human sleeping areas, providing targeted warmth exactly where it was needed most. Pigs, despite their reputation for messiness, were excellent winter housemates from a thermal perspective. They generate substantial body heat, they're intelligent enough to understand the arrangement, and they tend to be relatively calm in indoor settings once they're established in a routine. A pig positioned strategically near the family's sleeping area could provide hours of life-saving warmth throughout the night. Chickens presented their own unique advantages and challenges. They're small enough to be manageable indoors, they roost naturally so they don't take up much floor space, and they actually generate surprising amounts of heat relative to their size. Many families would encourage chickens to roost in baskets or simple perches positioned around the living area, creating multiple small heat sources distributed throughout the room. The smells, of course, were legendary. By the time spring arrived, the interior of a peasant's home carried an aroma that was complex. Layers of animal scent combined with months of smoke, human occupancy, and minimal ventilation created an olfactory experience that was undoubtedly powerful. But medieval peasants developed what we might call selective nose blindness. When survival is at stake, comfort preferences take a back seat to staying alive. More challenging were the logistics of managing animals in small spaces. Cows are large and can accidentally injure people in cramped quarters. Goats are curious and can be destructive if not properly managed. Pigs, while generally calm, are still substantial animals that require space and attention. Chickens can be noisy and messy. All of these animals have biological needs that don't pause for human convenience. Families developed sophisticated management systems. Animals were often tethered or confined to specific areas within the home. Straw or other bedding materials were strategically placed to manage waste and provide some barrier between animal and human living spaces. Feeding schedules were coordinated with human activities. Everyone in the family, including children, had responsibilities for managing their four-legged housemates. The psychological benefits of living with animals during the dark, isolated months of winter shouldn't be underestimated. Animals provided companionship, a sense of life and activity in otherwise static environments, and even entertainment during the long nights when there was little else to do. Children especially benefited from the presence of animals, which gave them responsibilities, comfort, and playmates during months when outdoor activities were impossible. From a practical standpoint, having livestock inside also provided security. Animals are sensitive to sounds, smells, and disturbances that humans might miss. A nervous cow or agitated chickens could alert the family to potential problems.
whether that was predators outside, unusual weather conditions, or other threats that might require attention. Perhaps most remarkably, these arrangements often worked smoothly. Medieval families developed routines and systems that allowed humans and animals to coexist in small spaces without major conflicts. Everyone, humans and animals alike, understood that they were all working together toward the same goal, surviving until spring returned and outdoor life became possible again. The livestock weren't just providers of warmth, they were partners in the long and difficult campaign against winter's attempt to kill everyone in the household. 4 legs or 2, fur or skin, everyone in the house was part of the same survival team.
Medieval peasant fashion had nothing to do with style, attractiveness, or making impressions at social gatherings. It was armor, flexible, layered, practical armor designed for one purpose: keeping death at bay long enough to see another spring. Every piece of clothing was chosen, worn, and maintained based on a single question: will this help me survive another day? The base layer was typically a linen undertunic, rough, scratchy, and probably not changed or washed for months at a time. Over this went a wool tunic, then potentially another wool layer if the family could afford it. Then leggings, also wool, that bagged at the knees and provided minimal insulation but were better than bare skin. Then a cloak, usually made from whatever animal hide or thick fabric the family could obtain, thrown over everything else like a final desperate barrier against the cold. The rule was beautifully simple. If you owned it, you wore it. All of it, at the same time. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of choosing between different outfits based on the weather or their activities. They had whatever clothes they possessed, and in winter, they put on every single piece simultaneously. The goal was to create as many layers as possible between their bodies and the hostile environment trying to kill them. Footwear presented its own challenges. Proper boots were expensive luxuries that most peasants couldn't afford. Instead, they wrapped their feet in layers of cloth, old rags, scraps of fabric, anything that could provide some barrier between their skin and the frozen ground. These improvised foot coverings were then stuffed into wooden clogs or simple leather shoes that offered minimal protection but were better than nothing. The irony of medieval peasant hygiene was that cleanliness was actually counterproductive to survival. Clean clothes, freshly washed linens, and scrubbed skin were all more vulnerable to cold than their dirty counterparts. As grime, sweat, and natural body oils built up in clothing, they created additional layers of insulation. That coating of accumulated dirt and grease filled in the gaps between fabric threads, making clothes more windproof and more effective at trapping body heat. What we might consider disgusting personal hygiene was actually a survival strategy. Medieval peasants learned that washing themselves or their clothes during winter could be dangerous. Wet clothing took days to dry in cold, humid conditions, and wearing damp fabric could lead to hypothermia and death. Clean skin was more vulnerable to wind and cold than skin protected by its natural oils and accumulated grime. So, medieval peasants developed what we might call strategic filthiness. They stopped washing regularly, not because they didn't understand cleanliness, but because they understood survival. That layer of accumulated dirt and body oil served as natural insulation, helping their clothes work more effectively as barriers against heat loss. They smelled terrible by modern standards, but they were warm, and warmth meant life. Layering wasn't just about putting on multiple garments, it was about creating air pockets between the layers that could trap body heat. Medieval peasants understood, through hard experience, that still air is an excellent insulator. Each layer created potential spaces where warm air could be captured and held close to the body. This meant that loose-fitting clothes were often more effective than tight garments, despite our modern instinct to bundle up tightly. Accessories took on life and death importance. A simple woolen hat could mean the difference between surviving the night and freezing to death, since humans lose substantial amounts of body heat through their heads. Mittens or gloves, even crudely made ones, protected hands from frostbite and allowed people to continue working despite cold temperatures.
Scarves or cloth wrapped around necks protected vital vessels from cold wind. Children were dressed like small, waddling bundles of fabric. Parents would wrap them in layer after layer until they could barely move, reasoning correctly that mobility mattered less than warmth. A child who could barely walk due to excessive clothing was safer than a child who could move freely but was inadequately protected against the cold. The economic reality was that clothes had to last. Most peasant families owned only a few garments total, and these had to serve for years. Clothing was patched, repatched, mended, altered, and passed down through generations. A cloak might serve a father, then a son, then a grandson, accumulating repairs and modifications, but continuing to provide essential protection against winter's assault. Interestingly, medieval peasants became experts at reading clothing for survival information. They could tell by looking at someone's dress how prepared they were for cold weather, how long they'd been outside, whether they were adequately protected against hypothermia. Clothing became a visual language that communicated survival status to anyone who understood how to interpret it. The psychological impact of proper winter clothing cannot be understated. Knowing you were as protected as possible provided mental comfort that helped people endure the months of hardship ahead.
As darkness fell each night, medieval peasant households transformed into carefully orchestrated survival operations. Sleep wasn't the restful, private experience we know today. It was a strategic group activity that required planning, coordination, and absolute commitment to keeping everyone alive until morning. The sleeping arrangements weren't decided by comfort, preference, or family hierarchy. They were determined by cold, practical mathematics of heat generation, heat retention, and heat distribution. The person who naturally ran the warmest might find themselves positioned to provide heat for the feet of 3 other family members. The smallest children were tucked between adults like precious cargo, surrounded by layers of human insulation. Pregnant women, elderly relatives, and anyone showing signs of illness received premium positions in the warmest spots available. But human heat sharing was just one element of the survival strategy. Medieval peasants developed sophisticated understanding of how different sleeping positions affected heat loss. Sleeping curled in tight balls minimized surface area exposed to cold air. Families would arrange themselves in interlocking positions that maximized contact between warm bodies while minimizing gaps where cold air could intrude. The bedding itself was a crucial component of the survival system. Straw mattresses, for all their discomfort and pest problems, created essential insulation between human bodies and the frozen ground. But the straw had to be managed carefully. Too compressed, and it lost its insulating properties. Too loose, and cold air could circulate freely through it. Families learned to fluff and redistribute their straw regularly, balancing insulation effectiveness with the reality that fresh straw was expensive and hard to obtain. Blankets and coverings were shared commodities rather than individual possessions. Every piece of fabric the family owned, cloaks, old tunics, scraps of cloth, animal hides, was deployed as part of the communal sleeping system. The goal was to create a sealed environment where body heat could be trapped and retained throughout the night. This meant that once the sleeping arrangement was established, moving or adjusting position was a community decision that affected everyone's warmth. One of the most critical aspects of nighttime survival was the shift system for fire management. Someone always had to remain responsible for monitoring the fire, even while the rest of the family slept. This person would doze lightly, waking periodically to check the fire status, add fuel if necessary, and ensure that the carefully banked coals were still alive. The responsibility typically rotated among family members, with older children and adults taking turns as the night watchmen. The psychological challenges of communal sleeping were substantial. Imagine trying to rest while pressed against multiple other bodies, listening to snoring, coughing, and the various sounds that large groups of people make during sleep. Privacy for personal needs required careful coordination.
Someone who needed to relieve themselves during the night had to extract themselves from the human pile without disrupting everyone else's warmth, venture into the freezing air of the house, then somehow reintegrate into the sleeping arrangement without causing too much disturbance. Families developed unspoken protocols for nighttime movements. Shifting position was done slowly and gradually, allowing others to adjust without losing their warm spots. Coughing or other disturbances were managed as quietly as possible. Children learned early to sleep deeply and move minimally, understanding that restless sleep could affect the survival of everyone in the family. The timing of sleep was also strategic. Families often went to bed shortly after sunset, not because they were particularly tired, but because the longer they could maintain the communal sleeping arrangement, the more fuel they could conserve, and the better their chances of maintaining warmth through the night. Early bedtime meant longer periods of shared body heat and reduced fuel consumption for heating. Early morning wake-up routines were equally strategic. Someone had to brave the morning cold first, revive the fire, and begin warming the space before the rest of the family exposed themselves to the hostile air. This person, usually whoever had drawn the last fire-watching shift, would carefully emerge from the warm cocoon of blankets and bodies to face the brutal reality of the morning temperature. Weather affected sleeping strategies significantly. On the coldest nights, when survival was most uncertain, families might decide to maintain continuous watch rather than risking everyone sleeping simultaneously. Extra bodies might be recruited from neighboring families, creating even larger human heating systems. Emergency supplies, heated stones, extra fuel, emergency food would be positioned within easy reach of the sleeping area. The success of these nighttime survival strategies depended entirely on cooperation and trust. Everyone had to participate willingly, follow the established protocols, and prioritize group survival over individual comfort. Selfishness or non-cooperation could literally mean death for the entire family. Children learn these lessons early and completely, understanding that winter nights were times when personal preferences became secondary to family survival. Despite the discomfort, the lack of privacy, and the constant awareness of danger, these sleeping arrangements worked. Families survived countless winters using these techniques, generation after generation, perfecting the art of communal warmth and strategic heat management.
While medieval peasants fought the external cold with layers of clothing and communal warmth, they discovered another crucial weapon in their survival arsenal: food as internal heating fuel. But this wasn't simply about eating enough calories. It was about understanding which foods generated the most internal heat, when to eat them, and how to make scarce resources provide maximum warming benefits. The medieval peasants' approach to winter eating was based on practical experience that modern nutrition science has largely confirmed. Heavy, dense foods require more energy to digest, and that digestive process generates heat throughout the body. It's like having an internal furnace that burns hotter and longer when you feed it the right fuel. Medieval peasants discovered this truth not through textbooks, but through the harsh teacher of experience. Eat the right foods before bed, and you might wake up alive in the morning. So what constituted the perfect medieval winter meal? Think hearty, stick-to-your-ribs fare that would make modern dietitians either applaud or faint, depending on their perspective. Thick stews dominated the evening menu, massive pots filled with whatever root vegetables could be scavenged or stored: turnips, onions, parsnips, and cabbage. These vegetables were cheap, kept well in cold storage, and provided the complex carbohydrates that burned slowly through the night like well-banked coals. Grains were absolute lifesavers in this internal heating strategy. Oat porridge, dense and filling, created a sustained warmth that could last for hours. Barley gruel, while not winning any taste awards, provided the kind of slow-burning energy that kept bodies functioning through the longest, coldest nights. Dark, chewy rye bread,
often the only bread peasants could afford, was packed with fiber and nutrients that required significant energy to digest, turning the stomach into a personal heating system. When families were fortunate enough to have meat, perhaps after a festival day, a successful hunt, or when a neighbor had to slaughter livestock, fatty cuts were prized above all others. Not because they tasted better, though they often did, but because fat provides more than twice the calories per gram of protein or carbohydrates. A chunk of salted pork or a slice of fatty bacon could provide internal warmth that lasted through the entire night. Peasants understood instinctively what nutritionists now know. Fat burns slower and hotter than lean protein. The timing of these hearty meals was crucial. Modern people might find it strange to eat their largest meal right before bed, but for medieval peasants, this was strategic survival planning. Eating heavily in the evening meant that during the most dangerous hours, when the fire was banked low and external temperatures plummeted, their bodies were working hardest to digest food, generating precious internal heat when it was needed most. Parents became fierce enforcers of this survival eating strategy. Children who were picky eaters didn't have the luxury of refusing foods based on taste preferences. "You'll eat those turnips or you'll shiver through the night thinking about how much you miss those turnips" wasn't just harsh parenting, it was life or death nutritional education. Every child learned early that winter meals weren't about enjoyment, they were about fuel, about internal fire, about staying alive until spring. The cooking methods themselves were designed to maximize both nutrition and heat generation. Long, slow cooking broke down tough fibers in vegetables and grains, making them easier to digest and more calorie-dense. Stews and porridges that simmered for hours concentrated flavors and nutrients while creating the kind of heavy, warming meal that could sustain a family through a brutal winter night. Of course, this heavy nighttime eating strategy came with its own challenges. Medieval peasants often went to bed feeling uncomfortably full, their stomachs working overtime to process enormous meals. This could lead to restless sleep, strange dreams, and digestive discomfort. But these minor inconveniences paled in comparison to the alternative, waking up hypothermic or not waking up at all. The psychological comfort of a full belly cannot be understated either. In a world where hunger was a constant companion and starvation a real threat, going to sleep with a stomach full of warm food provided mental as well as physical comfort. It was a small victory against the endless challenges of winter survival, a moment of abundance in a season of scarcity. What strikes me most about this medieval approach to food as fuel is how scientific it was, despite being developed by people with no formal education in nutrition or metabolism. Through generations of trial and error, observation and adaptation, they developed eating strategies that maximized their chances of survival. They turned their stomachs into personal heating systems and their evening meals into life-saving investments in internal warmth.
When medieval peasants had exhausted the obvious strategies for staying warm, multiple layers of clothing, shared body heat, and strategic positioning around the fire, they turned to one of humanity's oldest and most reliable heating innovations, the heated stone. This wasn't some sophisticated technology requiring special materials or complex construction. It was pure, practical genius, born from the simple observation that stones hold heat long after they're removed from fire. The process itself was elegantly simple, though not without its dangers. Someone in the family, often the person who had drawn the short straw in family discussions, would select a flat, smooth stone from around the hearth area. Size mattered. Too small, and the stone wouldn't retain heat long enough to be useful. Too large, and it became impossible to handle safely. The ideal heating stone was about the size of a dinner plate, thick enough to hold substantial heat, but manageable enough to transport without causing injury. The stone would be placed directly into the heart of the fire, nestled among the hottest coals and left to absorb heat for at least an hour.
This wasn't a casual process. The stone needed to reach temperatures that would allow it to radiate warmth for hours. The person tending the fire had to monitor the heating process carefully, turning the stone occasionally to ensure even heating, watching for cracks that might indicate the stone was absorbing heat too quickly and might shatter. Retrieving a stone heated to near dangerous temperatures required medieval ingenuity and considerable courage. Long wooden tools, iron tongs when available, or even carefully wrapped cloth were used to fish the glowing stone from the fire. The margin for error was thin. Drop the stone, and you might crack it, rendering it useless. Grab it wrong, and you'd burn your hands severely enough to make winter survival even more difficult. The wrapping process was an art form in itself. The heated stone had to be wrapped in enough material to prevent burns, but not so much that it couldn't radiate heat effectively. Old rags, scraps of wool, or pieces of leather were layered around the stone, creating a portable heating device that could be carried to wherever warmth was most needed. Some families developed sophisticated wrapping techniques, using different materials in layers to control the rate of heat transfer. Once properly wrapped, these medieval heating pads could be deployed strategically throughout the family's sleeping area. Stones might be placed at the foot of the communal bed to warm cold toes, tucked against the backs of elderly family members who struggled most with the cold, or positioned near infants whose small bodies were most vulnerable to hypothermia. The warmest person in the family might even hold a wrapped stone against their chest, allowing their body heat to combine with the stone's warmth to create a localized hot zone. The heated stone strategy required careful planning and timing. Stones heated too early in the evening might cool off before the coldest part of the night. Heated too late, and they might not provide warmth when it was most needed. Experienced families developed routines around stone heating, coordinating the process with banking the fire and arranging the family's sleeping positions. Some ingenious medieval families developed variations on the basic heated stone technique. Clay pots filled with heated stones could provide gentler, longer-lasting warmth. Stones wrapped in multiple layers of cloth could be unwrapped gradually through the night, extending their useful heating period. The largest stones might be heated and placed in wooden boxes lined with hay or straw, creating primitive but effective heating systems that could warm an entire sleeping area. The risks, of course, were substantial. Improperly wrapped stones could cause severe burns. Cracked stones could shatter explosively when heated, sending dangerous fragments across the room. Stones that were too hot could ignite bedding materials, turning a survival strategy into a house fire. Medieval families learned these lessons through hard experience, developing safety protocols that were passed down through generations like precious survival knowledge. But when everything went right, when the stone was properly selected, adequately heated, safely retrieved, and carefully wrapped, the results were nothing short of miraculous for a family facing a potentially deadly night. That warm stone could mean the difference between restful sleep and shivering wakefulness, between maintaining body heat and sliding into dangerous hypothermia. Children often became the family experts in stone heating, their small hands and quick reflexes making them ideal for the delicate work of wrapping hot stones safely. They learned to test the heat level by holding their hands near the wrapped stone to identify the perfect balance between useful warmth and dangerous heat. The heated stone represents something beautiful about medieval peasant survival. The ability to take the simplest materials, stone and fire, and transform them into life-saving technology through human intelligence and determination. In a world without electric blankets, central heating, or even basic insulation, a properly heated stone tucked into a straw mattress could provide hours of blessed warmth that made survival possible.
In the medieval world, winter survival wasn't just a personal or family challenge. It was a community endeavor that required the coordinated effort of entire villages working together against their common enemy, the killing cold. The harsh reality was simple. No one could make it through the worst winters alone, and communities that failed to support their most vulnerable members often found themselves decimated by spring.
Medieval villages developed informal but highly effective early warning systems for winter emergencies. Neighbors paid attention to each other's routines with an intensity that might seem intrusive by modern standards, but which was absolutely essential for survival. When smoke stopped rising from a neighbor's chimney for too long, when someone failed to appear at their usual daily activities, or when a household went suspiciously quiet, the community responded immediately. The village's unofficial winter watchers were often the people who couldn't contribute heavy physical labor, elderly residents who could no longer work the fields but possessed decades of experience reading winter's warning signs, and children who were too young for demanding work but could run messages quickly between houses. These watchers kept mental tallies of who was coughing too severely, whose food stores were running dangerously low, and which families were struggling most with the cold. When a family's fire went out, one of the most serious winter emergencies, the community response was swift and unquestioning. A neighbor would rush over with a burning coal wrapped in rags, or better yet, invite the cold family into their own already crowded home for the night. Yes, this meant squeezing extra bodies into spaces that were already at capacity, but the alternative, finding frozen neighbors in the spring, was unacceptable to communities that understood their mutual dependence. Food sharing during brutal winters operated on principles that were part charity, part insurance policy. Families with slightly better harvests or more successful preservation techniques would share with those facing starvation, not purely out of altruism, but with the understanding that winter was unpredictable and roles could easily reverse. Today, you might have enough turnips to share. Tomorrow, you might be the one knocking on doors hoping for a bowl of gruel. The communal food stores that some villages maintained were grim but necessary institutions. During the worst winters, when individual family reserves ran out, communities would pool their remaining resources, the last of the salted meat, the final stores of grain, whatever dried vegetables remained. These weren't abundant feasts. They were survival rations distributed with careful calculation to stretch resources as far as possible while keeping the maximum number of people alive. Children played crucial roles in these community support networks, despite their small size and limited strength. They served as messengers, running between houses to communicate urgent needs or coordinate assistance. They helped transport firewood, small amounts of food, or other essential supplies. Most importantly, they learned early that in winter, individual survival depended absolutely on community cooperation. Even long-standing village feuds and personal animosities were typically set aside during the most dangerous winter periods. The neighbor who had disputed your property boundaries in summer might be the person who showed up at your door with hot coals when your fire died in January. Survival trumped social conflicts because everyone understood that the village's winter survival rate affected everyone's long-term prospects. The lending and sharing of survival equipment created complex networks of mutual obligation that helped bind communities together. Families might share heated stones, extra blankets, or tools for fire management. Someone with a particularly effective method for banking fires might teach their neighbors, spreading life-saving knowledge throughout the community. These weren't formal educational programs. They were urgent, practical knowledge transfers that could mean the difference between life and death. Religious and spiritual support played important roles in community winter survival as well. Churches and monasteries, when they existed in or near villages, often served as emergency shelters for families whose homes became uninhabitable. Religious leaders organized prayers for community survival and sometimes coordinated resource sharing among parishioners. The spiritual comfort provided by shared religious observances helped communities maintain morale during the darkest months. Perhaps most remarkably, These medieval communities often managed to maintain not just survival, but elements of social life and cultural continuity even during the worst winters. Families would gather in the warmest houses for storytelling, song, or simple conversation. These weren't frivolous social activities. They were essential mental health support that helped people endure months of hardship while maintaining their connections to each other and their hope for spring. The community networks that kept medieval villages alive through winter demonstrate something profound about human nature. When survival is at stake, people can transcend individual selfishness and work together with remarkable efficiency and generosity. These weren't perfect communities. They had their conflicts, their inequalities, their failures. But when winter threatened to kill everyone, they understood that their individual fates were inextricably linked, and they acted on that understanding with a commitment that modern communities might find difficult to match.
When medieval peasants faced the merciless cold of winter, they didn't rely solely on practical strategies like fire banking and communal warmth. They turned to faith, superstitions, and spiritual practices that provided psychological comfort, and they believed divine protection against the forces trying to kill them. In a world where the line between life and death was often determined by factors beyond human control, spiritual practices became as essential as physical survival techniques. Faith wasn't compartmentalized into Sunday services and forgotten the rest of the week. It was woven into every aspect of winter survival, from the prayers whispered before banking the fire to the blessings sought over shared meals. Medieval peasants understood that they were fighting forces larger than themselves, not just cold and hunger, but what they perceived as spiritual battles between good and evil, life and death, hope and despair. Evening prayers in peasant households during winter took on special urgency and specificity. Families would kneel together before settling into their communal sleeping arrangements, offering urgent petitions for the night's survival. These weren't abstract theological discussions. They were practical requests for divine assistance. Keep the fire burning, prevent the roof from collapsing, help us wake up with all our fingers and toes. Let the stored food last until spring. Children learned early that prayer was as important as any other survival skill. Saints became personal advocates in the battle against winter's dangers. Saint Blaise was called upon to protect against throat ailments, a serious concern when a single mouthful of icy air could trigger coughing fits that might develop into fatal pneumonia. Saint Agatha was invoked for protection against fires, both to prevent accidental blazes and to keep hearth fires burning steadily. Saint Nicholas, later transformed into the jolly gift-giver of Christmas legend, was originally petitioned to protect households from sudden disasters and to ensure adequate provisions through the hungry months. Superstitious practices wrapped themselves around daily survival activities like protective charms. Some families sprinkled blessed water near their hearths before sleeping, believing it would ward off evil spirits or malicious forces that might extinguish their fires. Others marked their doorways with blessed chalk after certain feast days, creating spiritual barriers against misfortune. These practices weren't seen as separate from practical survival measures. They were integrated into the total strategy for making it through winter alive. Candles played special roles in medieval winter spirituality, serving both practical and symbolic functions. Special vigil candles, often blessed by local priests or the village's most pious elders, were sometimes kept burning throughout the night as flickering prayers against the darkness. These candles provided minimal heat and light, but their steady flames represented hope, continuity, and divine presence during the most dangerous hours. For families barely able to afford fuel for their main fires, dedicating resources to maintain vigil candles represented significant spiritual commitment. The promises and bargains peasants made with God during their most desperate moments reveal both their faith and their pragmatic understanding of survival.
"Dear Lord, if you just get us through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips." These weren't sophisticated theological negotiations. They were the raw, honest pleas of people who understood their utter dependence on forces beyond their control. Ritual observances continued even during the worst winter conditions, sometimes requiring significant sacrifice. Feast days were observed with whatever meager celebrations families could manage, not because they had abundant resources, but because maintaining spiritual traditions provided essential psychological anchor points during months of hardship. A small portion of precious food might be set aside for a religious celebration, or a family might brave dangerous weather to attend church services. Understanding that spiritual nourishment was as crucial as physical sustenance. The role of local religious leaders, priests, monks, or simply the most spiritually respected community members became especially important during winter crises. These individuals often coordinated community prayer efforts, provided spiritual counseling to families facing disaster, and sometimes served as mediators in disputes over resource sharing. Their presence represented continuity with larger spiritual traditions and connection to divine protection that extended beyond individual families. Weather-related omens and signs were interpreted through spiritual lenses that helped communities make sense of unpredictable conditions. Unusual cloud formations, animal behavior, or other natural phenomena were read as divine communications about the likely severity of approaching weather. While these interpretations weren't scientifically accurate, they provided psychological frameworks for preparing mentally and spiritually for whatever challenges were approaching. Perhaps most importantly, faith provided hope, the essential psychological fuel that enabled people to keep fighting for survival even when conditions seemed hopeless. The belief that spring would eventually return, that their suffering had meaning, that divine forces were ultimately watching over them, gave medieval peasants the mental strength to endure hardships that might have broken communities without such spiritual foundations.
For all the ingenuity, prayers, community support, and stubborn determination that medieval peasants brought to their battle against winter, the harsh truth remains. Sometimes winter won. And when it did, the victory was absolute, devastating, and heartbreakingly final. The historical records, sparse as they are, tell stories of winters that didn't just challenge communities, they erased them entirely from the map of human existence. Some winters were particularly merciless, earning names that still echo through historical accounts centuries later. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, triggered by years of unusually cold and wet weather, created a catastrophic cascade of failures. Crops rotted in flooded fields, livestock starved when fodder supplies failed, and the cold became not just uncomfortable, but actively lethal to populations already weakened by malnutrition. In the worst affected areas, death rates climbed to levels that seem almost unimaginable today. Some communities losing 30 to 50% of their population over just a few brutal winters. The mechanics of winter death in medieval times were often slow and agonizing rather than sudden and merciful. Families who failed to keep their fires alive didn't simply freeze instantly. They gradually succumbed to hypothermia over hours or days, growing weaker and more confused as their core body temperatures dropped. Neighbors would sometimes discover entire households in spring, bodies arranged as if the family had tried desperately to share warmth until the very end, parents wrapped around children, elderly grandparents surrounded by younger family members in a final, futile attempt at mutual warmth. Structural failures could turn survival shelters into death traps in moments. Roofs weighted down by heavy snow didn't just leak, they collapsed catastrophically, often in the middle of the night when families were sleeping beneath them. The combination of heavy timber, thatch, and accumulated snow created crushing weights that medieval construction techniques couldn't always withstand. Survivors, if there were any,
faced the nightmare of trying to dig family members from freezing debris while exposed to the same brutal weather that had caused the disaster. Disease thrived in the cramped, poorly ventilated conditions that winter survival required. Families packed together in small spaces, sharing air and bodily warmth, created perfect conditions for respiratory illnesses to spread rapidly through entire households. A simple cold that might have been manageable in warmer months could develop into bronchitis or pneumonia when combined with malnutrition, cold stress, and the body's depleted immune system. Medieval medical knowledge was powerless against these cascading health failures. Frostbite was perhaps winter's most insidious weapon, a slow, progressive injury that stole pieces of people, even if it didn't kill them outright. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses that turned black with cold damage often had to be amputated if the victim survived at all. Some villagers carried winter's marks for the rest of their lives, missing digits, scarred skin, or permanent nerve damage that served as grim reminders of just how close they had come to complete destruction. The psychological toll of winter mortality was as devastating as the physical deaths themselves. Communities that lost significant portions of their population one winter faced not just immediate grief, but the terrifying knowledge that their reduced numbers made future survival even more precarious. Fewer people meant less collective body heat, reduced ability to share resources, and decreased capacity to support the most vulnerable community members. Winter deaths could trigger downward spirals that doomed communities over multiple seasons. What strikes modern readers as perhaps most haunting is how normalized death became during the worst winters. Medieval communities developed what we might call survival triage, informal but understood systems for determining who was most likely to survive and therefore deserved the community's limited resources. The very old, the very young, the chronically ill and the disabled were sometimes quietly allowed to die so that healthier community members might have better chances of making it to spring. These weren't decisions made from cruelty, but from the brutal mathematics of survival when resources simply couldn't sustain everyone. Yet even in their darkest moments, when death seemed inevitable, medieval peasants often continued fighting. Archaeological evidence from sites of winter disasters shows families that kept trying to maintain fires even as they weakened, that continued sharing body heat even as some family members died, that kept their children close and warm until their own strength finally gave out. There's something both heartbreaking and inspiring about these final acts of love and determination. The records also revealed the remarkable psychological resilience of surviving communities. Villages that lost half their population one winter would rebuild, repopulate, and face the next winter with the same combination of practical preparation and stubborn hope that had characterized their predecessors. Death wasn't accepted as inevitable, it was acknowledged as possible, mourned when it occurred, and then defied again when the next cold season arrived.
When we look back across the centuries at those muddy, frost-bitten, smoke-stained medieval peasants who somehow managed to survive winter after brutal winter, it's easy to focus on their hardships and miss the extraordinary legacy they created. These weren't just people who endured harsh conditions, they were innovators, problem solvers, and community builders who developed survival strategies so effective that their descendants not only survived, but eventually thrived beyond anything those original peasants could have imagined. Every technique we've explored, from fire banking to communal sleeping, from strategic dirt accumulation to heated stone therapy, represents a piece of hard-won human knowledge that was tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. These weren't theoretical survival concepts developed in comfortable academic settings. They were life and death solutions forged by people who understood that a single mistake, a moment of poor judgment, or a failure of community cooperation could mean extinction for their entire family line. The ingenuity these peasants displayed under pressure is genuinely breathtaking when you consider their limitations. Without formal education, without scientific understanding of thermodynamics or nutrition, without access to manufactured materials or advanced tools, they developed heating systems, insulation techniques,
food preservation methods, and social support networks that enabled human survival in conditions that would challenge modern people armed with all our technological advantages. Their approach to community cooperation created social models that influenced human development for centuries. The understanding that individual survival depended absolutely on group success led to innovations in resource sharing, mutual aid, and collective decision-making that formed foundations for later social institutions. Medieval villages that successfully navigated multiple winters together developed government systems, economic relationships, and cultural traditions that proved remarkably durable and adaptable. Perhaps most importantly, these medieval survivors passed down something more precious than any individual survival technique: an unshakable understanding that humans can endure incredible hardships and emerge not just alive, but stronger. Every generation that made it through seemingly impossible winters proved to their children that resilience wasn't just possible, it was their birthright. This psychological inheritance may have been their greatest gift to future generations. The genetic legacy is equally remarkable. The people we're descended from aren't just anyone who happened to live in medieval times, they're specifically the ones who were tough enough, smart enough, resourceful enough, and cooperative enough to survive conditions that killed their neighbors. Natural selection during these brutal winters was intense and unforgiving. The medieval peasants who became our ancestors represent a winnowed population of human beings who possessed whatever combination of physical hardiness, mental toughness, and social intelligence was necessary to keep their family lines going through humanity's harshest trials. Their innovations influenced technological development in ways we're still discovering. The agricultural techniques they developed to maximize crop yields in harsh conditions, the architectural solutions they created for cold weather construction, the food preservation methods they perfected, all of these contributed to humanity's expanding toolkit for survival and prosperity. Some of their techniques remained in use for centuries, only being replaced when industrial technology finally offered superior alternatives. The cultural impact is equally profound. The stories, songs, traditions, and celebrations that medieval communities developed during their long winter months of survival created cultural foundations that persist in modified forms today. Our concepts of hospitality, community mutual aid, holiday celebrations, and even family bonding activities trace back to practices that were originally developed as winter survival strategies. What strikes me most powerfully is how these medieval peasants created abundance from scarcity, community from isolation, and hope from desperation. They looked at conditions that seemed designed to kill them and found ways not just to survive, but to maintain their humanity, their relationships, their joy in small pleasures, and their dreams for better futures. They gathered around smoky fires and told stories. They shared their meager food with neighbors in need. They celebrated feast days even when there wasn't enough to feast on. They created music, maintained traditions, and passed down knowledge to their children. Every warm house we live in today, every reliable heating system we take for granted, every abundant grocery store we shop in, every winter coat we purchase without thinking, all of these represent the fulfillment of dreams that medieval peasants held during their coldest, darkest nights. They endured so that we might thrive. They developed survival techniques so that their descendants might never need to use them. They built communities that could withstand the worst conditions imaginable so that future generations could live in communities defined by comfort and security rather than mere survival. The blood of medieval winter survivors flows in our veins. Their stubborn refusal to surrender to impossible odds, their creative problem solving under extreme pressure, their commitment to community cooperation, and their unshakable faith that spring would eventually come, all of these qualities live on in us. We are their ultimate victory over winter's ancient threat, their proof that human ingenuity and determination can overcome any challenge nature throws at us.
As I sit here in my heated home, writing these words while snow falls gently outside my window, I can't help but think about what we modern humans might learn from these medieval winter survivors. Their world seems impossibly distant from ours. We flip switches to heat our homes, turn handles to access clean water, and drive to stores stocked with food from around the globe.
Yet the fundamental challenges they faced, and more importantly, the qualities they developed in facing them, remain remarkably relevant to our modern lives. The first lesson that strikes me is their understanding of true priorities. When survival is at stake, you quickly learn to distinguish between what's actually necessary and what's merely convenient. Medieval peasants knew the difference between comfort and survival, between wants and needs. They could focus their limited energy and resources on what actually mattered: staying alive, maintaining relationships, and preserving hope. In our modern world of endless distractions and artificial urgencies, there's profound wisdom in their laser focus on what truly counts. Their approach to community cooperation offers powerful insights for our increasingly individualistic society. These medieval villagers understood viscerally that their individual survival depended absolutely on group success. They couldn't afford the luxury of pure selfishness because they knew that helping their neighbors today might mean receiving life-saving assistance tomorrow. They created support networks based on mutual dependence and genuine care for each other's welfare. In our modern world, where loneliness and social isolation have become epidemic problems, their model of interdependent community support offers compelling alternatives to our often disconnected way of living. The resilience they demonstrated in the face of seemingly impossible odds provides inspiration for anyone dealing with modern challenges. These peasants faced conditions that would break many people today, yet they didn't just endure. They found ways to maintain their humanity, their relationships, and their hope for better times. They understood that resilience isn't just about toughing out difficult periods. It's about maintaining your core values and connections even when everything external seems to be falling apart. Their innovation under extreme constraints offers lessons for modern problem solving. With almost no resources, no formal education, and no technological advantages, they created solutions that kept them alive under conditions that would challenge us, even with all our modern advantages. They teach us that innovation doesn't require expensive equipment or advanced degrees. It requires careful observation, creative thinking, and the willingness to try new approaches when old ones aren't working. Some of our most elegant modern solutions could learn from their approach of working with natural systems rather than trying to overpower them. Perhaps most importantly, they demonstrate the power of hope and determination in the face of overwhelming challenges. These people lived through winters that killed their neighbors, destroyed their homes, and threatened everything they cared about, yet they kept trying, kept cooperating, kept planning for spring. They understood something that we sometimes forget in our comfortable lives, that hope isn't a passive emotion. It's an active choice to keep working toward better outcomes, even when success isn't guaranteed. Their relationship with uncertainty also offers modern insights. We live in an age of weather forecasts and insurance policies and emergency services, yet we often feel anxious about uncertainties that our medieval ancestors would have considered minor inconveniences. They lived with daily uncertainty about whether they would survive until spring, yet they found ways to maintain peace of mind, strong relationships, and even joy in small pleasures. They teach us that security isn't about controlling every variable. It's about developing the confidence and community connections to handle whatever comes. The integration of practical and spiritual approaches in their survival strategies speaks to something our often materialistic culture sometimes overlooks. These peasants understood that surviving extreme challenges requires attention to both physical and psychological needs. They combined practical fire banking techniques with heartfelt prayers, strategic resource sharing with spiritual community support. They teach us that human beings need both practical solutions and spiritual sustenance to thrive under pressure. Their long-term thinking, despite facing immediate survival challenges, offers lessons for our often short-sighted modern approach to problems. Even while fighting for their lives through individual winters,
They were thinking about what knowledge to pass to their children, what community relationships to maintain, what preparations to make for future challenges. They balanced immediate survival needs with longer-term community and family well-being in ways that we might learn from as we face our own complex modern challenges. As we face our own modern winters, whether they're economic uncertainties, social challenges, environmental concerns, or personal difficulties, the example of these medieval survivors reminds us that human beings are capable of extraordinary resilience, creativity, and cooperation when we need to be. They survived so that we could thrive, and in their memory, we owe it to ourselves and to future generations to live up to the strength and wisdom they've passed down to us.